Now Moses went back and continued to strive, to fast and to deny himself. And he lived a very austere life and denied himself much as his weakened condition could. And I imagine some of you are wondering, well, what has that to do with me? I'm not called to be a monastic. What does that have to do with me? Why would somebody do that? Now, to answer why would somebody do such a thing, I want to tell you another story. And I hope you don't mind stories. But there was a kingdom, and they had a tradition that every year they would go out to the road, the highway by their kingdom, and they would ask somebody to be their king. And if he would accept it, then they would make him king with the full authority of the king to make decrees and to command people and to live in the palace, and his orders would be obeyed. Now, what they didn't tell the man, and they were forbidden to say anything to him about that, was that at the end of 1 year, he would be stripped naked and exiled to an island not too far from that country. And there he would freeze and starve to death and die. 1 year, they asked the man if he would like to be their king. He said, "What are you talking about?" I said, you could be our king. He said, "Quit jibing me." He said, "No, we really mean it." Well, finally he was convinced. He says, "Okay, what's the catch?" "No, you get to be our king." Of course, there was a catch. Well, this man was different. He began to walk through the city as king, and people would say, "Your Highness, Your Majesty." But he began to notice that the widows and the poor didn't have much, and so he decreed that the widows and the orphans would be provided for. He saw the sick suffering and so forth, so he decreed that there be hospitals built. And he saw the kids idle, and he decreed that there be schools established, and that the smarter ones would teach the dumber ones, or the more ignorant ones. And he saw ugly places where things had run down, and he decreed that it would be a fund to pay young people to plant gardens and flowers and to beautify the kingdom. And the people began to say, "This is a good one. He's really doing a good job." And he was so kind, never thinking of himself, that they thought, well, I'd like to have him for at least another year, but their law didn't allow that. Finally, one of his maids was in the room with him. She says, "I could be killed for telling you this." She says, "Lock the door." She said, "But at the end of this year, they're going to strip you naked and exile you to the island." He said, "What?" He says, "This is what we've done. We've done this to kings for years and years, perhaps centuries." He says, "Then I should leave." She says, "Well, I'm warning you. I just don't tell anybody that I told you." But he thought about it a moment. He said, "Well, wait a minute. Will they still obey my decrees until the end of the year?" She said, "Yes." "And if I command and order this, they'll do it?" She said, "Well, yes." And so the next day he decreed that the palace be built on the island. And he decreed that a boat be built and a dock placed on the island. And he decreed that they would send over cows and sheep and goats and chickens to the garden. And he decreed that they would take flowers and all the good fruit-bearing and vegetable-bearing plants and plant them over there. And every day, something was sent to the island. Now, he didn't elect the kingdom. He had for himself two goals: to make the kingdom as beautiful and blessed as he could, but also to prepare for his future. And so, by the time that year was up, people were dying to go to the island. They wanted to go there, and some people had actually swum over because they liked him so much as king, they wanted to be in his kingdom, not in whoever was going to come next. And so at the end of the year, the citizens came to him and said, well, Your Highness, give us your clothes. We're going to exile you to that island over there. He said, darn. Now that was the first 401k retirement plan. Well, this story tells why people live the way they do. They made this world was only a preparation. When Jesus says, lay not up for yourselves treasures on earth where moth and rust corrupt, he's speaking of this. He's telling us to be otherworldly minded, to take seriously our eternity. I've had people tell me, it's smart, to have a 401k plan. It's smart to buy your gravesite. It's smart to have a pension and all this stuff. And so they smartly do all that, and their old age is going to go like that, because this life is a blink of an eye. What about their eternity? How smart is it to prepare for 20 years when eternity is beyond that? And to give no heed to your eternity. Well, that's what these monks did. They lived for the kingdom of heaven. And everything they did was to please God. They wanted treasure which would not corrupt, which would not be eaten by moths. And that's why they lived the way they did. And they gave all. And Christ asks all from us. Now, he's very merciful. I'm not saying that if you can't live the way they did, God's mercy is such that who knows, maybe even I will be saved. But we must hear the commandments. There's a very sad story to me. You have the rich man and Lazarus. Lazarus was crippled. He couldn't walk. He had sores all over his body that the dogs licked. And the rich man, who doesn't even have a name in the scripture, he's just called the rich man, he lived sumptuously, as the scripture says. He fared well. He ate plenty. And because of his rich life, he went to hell. And because of Lazarus' cross, he went to heaven. Now that story really bothered me at first. I said, wait a minute, that guy didn't have an iPhone. He didn't have air conditioning. He didn't have a nice car. He didn't have TV. If he was rich, then we're way rich. And if that's the consequence of being rich, woe unto us. But the fathers say, if this man had shared of his wealth, if he had been generous, if he had given and shared his plenty, he wouldn't have gone to hell. Of course, without God's mercy, nothing that you can do counts. And so, we must not only beware of our life of comfort and indulgence, but that we must give. Giving is so critical. That's what Moses' life became, more and more giving. Mother Teresa took food to a woman and her family, and she went into the house and she brought a big bag of food. The woman rejoiced and praised God, and then took half of it and poured it into another sack and ran out. She said, I'll be right back. And she ran out the door. And Mother Teresa wondered, well, where did she go? And she came back empty-handed. She said, well, where did you go? She says, well, there are hungry people all around here, and I had to share it with them. And Mother Teresa thought, this woman has a family. This food will be gone in an instant, just about in a day or two, and yet she shares it. but she knew the sorrow of poverty, of hunger. And so we must remember that giving is a blessing. Jesus says, I think it's Luke 6, give and it shall be given to you. Good measure, pressed down, running over and shaken together, shall men give into your bosom. For with the same measure that you meet, so shall it be measured to you. And so we see that in giving, Moses began to be transformed. It was as if that act of giving triggered his heart to love. Because that little bit of giving becomes an avenue for God's grace to work on your heart, to make you more inclined to share that which God has given to you.